Just before we get started, I want to apologize. I actually had something come up today, and so I'm going to need to jet right after class. So my office hours, I have to actually switch them around a little bit today. So from 3:30 to 4:30, if you guys want to come in, I'll be in my office. And then I'm around tomorrow too, sort of touch and go. So if you can't make it to those hours, just shoot me an email, and we can figure out a time to grab a cup of coffee tomorrow. Of course, right, Wednesday is the midterm, and we'll spend a little time. I'm just going to go over, again, leaving a little bit of time to talk about the midterm and, sort of what we're looking at. But before we start that, any questions, any news before we jump back in and wrap up the Acadian period? These are also going to be, this lecture is going to be posted as of 3 o'clock, so everything should be up and running, and it'll give you time to come in on Tuesday too, if you have any other questions for Tony or myself. Yeah? Okay. All right. So we're gonna pick up where we left off. Last time we talked about the establishment of the Akkadian Empire under Sargon of Akkad around 2350 BCE. And we spent a long time looking at the origins and the mythology surrounding Sargon's rise to power. Sargon, right, again, his name being Sharukin, or the rightful ruler, meaning that he's probably not. But again, an individual who was able to forge Mesopotamia's first true empire, an empire that reached all the way from the Mediterranean Sea to the Persian Gulf. Now, Agade, the capital city of this empire, again, probably somewhere located near Kish in central Akkad, a city that is still unknown to this day. But we do have many great works of art from this period, art that we saw last time adopted Sumerian traditions and iconography. All of these, attributes of kingship, worship of the gods, things that we've come to expect, but now presented in a very different way, presented in a way that justifies the rightful rule of an Akkadian king, in this case Sargon, for political purposes, legitimizing his rule. We saw this in a few different settings. We see it in public settings, right? We looked at this victory stele last time, victory stele of Sargon, and looked at its use of registers, its use of imagery and motifs, which parallel quite closely the stele of the vultures, right? This early dynastic stele. Sargon's now using the same iconography, but this time, right, sending a very different message about unified kingship. It's no longer about the city-state. Now it's about this empire that he's forged. We see it in more private settings, right? We've seen it in Akkadian cylinder seals. In this case, right, same iconography, this nude belted hero, but being used for Akkadian administrative purposes. And some changes there too, right? In Akkadian art, we talked about that shift towards a more realistic representation of the body. This emphasis on corporeality, showing things as they are. I mean, down to the musculature in the legs. And again, this is on a cylinder seal, right? A tremendously small, tiny piece of glyptic art. The attention to detail and the skill involved is just fantastic. The bent toes, and this conspicuous use of negative space, inscriptions now being part of the composition. This is Akkadian art reaching an entirely new level, and that sort of is the apex of it, is with this wonderful copper head that we left off with last time, often said to be the head of Sargon himself, probably a little bit later, probably a later king, most likely Naram Sin, who we're going to be talking about today, who is Sargon's grandson. But this emphasis on realism in art, the great skill, the precious materials that go into it. Again, these eyes that were gouged out at a later date, ritually killed, the ears that were cleaved off. The eyes were probably made with precious stones that would have been, again, traded for. Lapis lazuli coming all the way from Afghanistan. Copper that had to be mined in Sinai. All these items coming from the farthest reaches of the empire coming together to forge these art pieces that really underscore what the Akkadian Empire is all about, right? Which is, forging this one political entity that's a real powerhouse and something that we haven't seen up until this point. And again, right, even this appropriating, again, those Sumerian attributes of kingship, right? We've looked at the hair planing. This looks almost exactly like the gold helmet of Miscalamdug, the hair bun, which goes back into the early dynastic period, even earlier. And so Sargon, again, this is a conspicuous use and a very conscious use of using somebody else's iconography to now portray himself in a new light and bring this new sense of what kingship is to the fore. This process, of course, is not an easy one. In later Babylonian texts that claim to be the autobiography of Sargon, we have Sargon writing in the first person, and he talks about how at the old age of 55, all the lands revolted against me. They besieged me in Agade, but the old lions still had teeth and claws. I went forth in battle and defeated them. I knocked them over and destroyed their vast armies. Now any king who wants to call himself my equal, let him go wherever I went, and let him do whatever I have done. And as we'll see when we get to later periods, again, Sargon was this model of kingship that later Mesopotamian kings looked to. In fact, we'll actually see in the Neo-Assyrian period a king who names himself Sargon and actually goes to the places Sargon went. But more on that later, and especially after the midterm. The Akkadian dynasty survives for about 200 years this way. It passes from Sargon to his son Rimush. Rimush reigns for 9 years, passes to Rimush's brother after his death, to Manishtushu. And during this time, again, they're constantly putting down rebellions. We have the regnal years of these kings, which are little descriptive epitaphs of what takes place during these reigns. And many times we see putting down a rebellion in the south, building a temple, these sorts of things that we know a king is supposed to do. By the third generation, we see kingship pass to the grandson of Sargon, a king named Naram Sin. And again, this process, Naram Sin inherits an empire which is a well-oiled political machine. We saw last time in that discussion of Sargon establishing the empire, how he appointed circuit officials, people who were at set distances from Agade, to administer the empire. We saw how he appointed a court of over 5,000 Akkadians to really administer things in the south, sort of a standing army of people he knew would be loyal to him to put down rebellions. And also, just in terms of the military tactics used during this period, we're going to see in later periods amazing military tactics, the use of siege weaponry by the Neo-Assyrian period. But even at this early stage, Sargon is trying new things. He's mixing up military units, so he's sending in infantry in addition to archers, and mixing them up and using them in ways that allow him to maintain this empire by force. And this is something that actually continues up until Alexander, the use of mixed military units, something that Sargon pioneers at this very early date. So Naram Sin inherits this empire, and does what any good king would do, what any good Akkadian king would do. He maintains it, and he actually ends up spreading its borders even farther. This is a stele fragment from the reign of Naram Sin. It comes from Diyarbakir in Turkey, right up around here. Actually, it's a very. It comes from a site called Amida. And it's a very important site in the sense that it commands a crossing of the Tigris River. So a strategically important place in the north. We find evidence of Naram Sin not only pushing the boundaries of the empire, but also setting up victory stele in situ, up there, right? We have evidence that he was actually there. So not just a whole bunch of hot air that he's blowing in his annals. This is actually taking place. But Naram Sin is a very interesting character for a number of reasons. He is a traditional Akkadian king in the tradition of his father, his uncle, his grandfather. But Naram Sin begins to break with this tradition, doing some very interesting things. he actually ends up crossing this line. We've seen how this notion of kingship, which begins under Sargon, this mythological sort of origin and great kingship. Sargon, right, takes these grand titles, the king of the four corners of the universe. Naram Sin ends up taking it a step further, and perhaps a step too far. He actually proclaims himself to be a god altogether. And we know this, he actually prefixes his name in his inscriptions with the sign Ilu, which means God. So the god Naram Sin. And this is a pretty radical shift for Mesopotamia. He calls himself the god of Agade, adopting this sense of what a city god should be. We've seen how all of these Mesopotamian cities, Uruk, right, they have their specific city gods. Inanna being the goddess of Uruk. In this case, Naram Sin is setting himself up to be the god of Agade. And when we think about this, 2 generations before, right, we had Sargon installing Enheduanna, his daughter, right, who had a Sumerian mother, this respect for the traditions of Sumer. She becomes high priestess. We read some of her poetry last time. What Naram Sin is doing is really pushing the boundaries in a very radical and dangerous way. We don't have Agade. Agade is missing, but we do have some construction dating to the reign of Naram Sin. This is a plan from the site of Tel Brak, and if you remember, Tel Brak was that very important site with the eye temple, those small votive eye figurines. Naram Sin clear cuts it, builds right on top of this eye temple. And what he builds is this enormous structure, which is about 90 meters by 85 meters. It's fortified. It's this huge, huge thing. We're talking 10-meter thick walls, some sort of fortress, a warehouse, but also, right, the use of a central court and perhaps what might be throne rooms in these cases. The attributes of perhaps a palace, right, like what we saw at Ebla during the early dynastic period. But this is very consistent, right? The fact that he's building a palace or perhaps what might be a temple to himself, a combination therein, on top of the Tel Brak Eye Temple is very, very telling. And in fact, you can see here in this image, the facade that he uses to decorate this temple is a niched, it's a version of the niched mud brick facade. So again, perhaps going hand in hand with this idea of his divinization. Naram Sin also institutes a practice during this period that will continue into later years. We talked about brick types, right? We saw the emergence of mud brick architecture, the use of plano-convex bricks, the use of Rimshan bricks during the Uruk period. Now, Naram Sin, during the Akkadian period, actually writes his name on the bricks themselves. So his structure, he's got these stamped bricks that have the name Naram Sin on them. So any king who would come and question where this monument came from, who built it, could actually just look at the bricks it's made of and would find the name of Naram Sin on them. And of course, as archaeologists, this is fantastic because when you're looking at a site which is building after building after building, literally the names of these rulers, when they come in, how they build and expand on each other's monuments, it's very, very useful. This is actually a process that continues all the way up into the modern day. Saddam Hussein, when he was in power, and he would come and fix these monuments and do reconstructions, he would put his name on the bricks in the sort of tradition of a Mesopotamian king. And indeed, there are other monuments that he makes where he portrays himself as a Mesopotamian king. So it's very interesting. We'll look at some of those reconstructions later that he was a part of.